Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Shush! Oh, you pooped. Good. Why don't you go upstairs by Mommy? She misses you. Yes. I'm making a video, yes. You want to come over here? You want to come over here? Magic. All right. Something about a roll of paper toweling does kind of take away from the ambiance. And I do have that on. Good. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am OmnusI. Welcome to the day after Halloween. Today I have a bit of a story for you, and it's, for some, perhaps a bit of a horror story, because I did something that some people might have done before or dreamed up, but some people might see this as a little bit, well, let's just say not quite honorable. But I just, last night, on Halloween, held a party for some friends, which was only turned slightly sideways when only 2 of them showed up. But my plans were already laid, and I was prepared for all of my guests to arrive if they had. So, the party was, as is my custom, a game night, where my friends come over and they enjoy the plethora of board and card games that I have. But not tonight. Tonight I had something special in mind. Now, many of my friends are not role-playing game players. They have played similar games in some extent. If you want, check out my Massive Darkness gameplay videos and you'll understand the kind of role-play-like games they've played in the past. None of the real role-play, but the strategy is fairly sound about ganging up on your enemies and not splitting the party and all those fun things. Well, they've played some of those games, so what I did may not seem quite so heinous, but I was reaching for something a bit more. I ran an ambush role-playing game for my friends. And I'm going to tell you how I did it, because I think that it's something that some people might really enjoy, and possibly the mechanics might be something you might enjoy even without the ambush aspect. There might be a few little wrinkles in there that you might find appealing. So, let's begin. First of all, I sent out the invitation to get, well, I cast out my net, so about 10 of my friends were invited, but I knew not all of them were going to show up. After all, this was Halloween. Some people are family men and couldn't make it. And some were just, well, let's just put it this way, they don't socialize all that much. So be it. I had 2 friends that showed up and one only for most of that time, so it worked out all right. Just got a lot of individual attention to what we were doing. When they arrived, they found that I had set things up fairly well. Off to one side, away from the game table, I had snacks, candy for their children. I like to take care of the families. So I had little goodie bags for all their little ghouls and goblins they have at home. I had, of course, my game table set up so that they could all sit in one space with, enough distance apart to be socially responsible. And I had every little trick that I could conveniently throw together. I had taken out the light bulb in the fixture over there for a little extra darkness. I had my fog machine going. I had over on my TV a looping video called Haunted Mansion. It shows slightly spooky scenes like jack-o'-lanterns with flickering eyes or a skull in a laboratory. Nice high-definition stuff. It's quite good. A little ambiance music, crow calls, things like that. Again, nothing over the top, but it helps to set a mood. Now, I could have gone much farther than that. I was thinking originally about putting candles everywhere, but my costume has long sleeves. That might be a problem. So I only had 2 candles out. I had my little ghost candle that I had found at St. Vincent de Paul for not much. You can see little eyes when it's lit. And, of course, I had I love these bleeding skull candles. So those were both going to, again, try to set the mood. So my friend showed up, and what did he see but 7 manila envelopes. Like this. Each one with a black and white picture on the front depicting an adventurer of some degree. All of them just taken off of Google Images, quite honestly. Some frightfully good art out there, really. So I easily was able to find one for each character that I had in mind, and I put that on top of the manila envelope. Each player was allowed to select their own packet. However, the 3 mission-critical characters I had set out with the others in reserve in case I had more players. I didn't need to worry about that, but it helps to be prepared. So, when they selected their character, they were able to go inside, and inside was 1 sheet of paper, 1 20-sided die, and 1 character miniature. This is the cleric, 20-sided die, ready to go. I have plenty of 20-sided dice, that wasn't a problem. The piece of paper is not a character sheet. That is the important thing when you're going to ambush somebody. You want to take the game out of view for the time. The 20-sided die was a tip-off for anybody who'd played role-playing games before, but for complete newbies, not so much. So, the sheet, however, was just a few paragraphs, nothing too serious. I'm going to read you the one that I have for the cleric, however. The first is a framing paragraph to tell the story of what I had intended so far and to put their players into a reason why their characters would trust each other and be together. You met the others of the company randomly, coming together to head off a goblin uprising. Most of you survived, making sure the goblins won't be a threat for several generations to come. You got a measure of money and hard-earned experience. Now, a small group of you have been hired to help a village being oppressed by a bandit who fancies himself a warlord. On the way, you can't afford horses for everyone yet, so you're going on foot. You hit a nasty storm with driving rain, thunder, and lightning. You move to the cover of the forest for shelter, but get separated from the rest of your comrades, except for those you see around you. So that sets that up. Now, the character information. You are Sullivan, a cleric who serves the light, the force who keeps the evil forces of darkness at bay. You have a talent for seeing all sides of situations and a connection to the light that others envy. You have the ability to call down power to heal others, but only once a day did you get this precious gift until you gain more power. The company values this power and your potential, so your safety is a priority. You have several skills and abilities to help your group. Vile darkness creatures and undead can be driven away by your conviction if you spend a moment to try to turn them away. You also have your healing ability, and your training in religion and fighting the darkness may give you valuable insights. And don't forget your healing. You are considered very wise, and your strength is pretty solid. You are a little bit clumsy, however. You are not quiet, and you rely on thick chainmail to protect you and a shield to ward off blows. You're rarely ill and can take a bit of punishment, but don't want to be the center of the team's defensive wall. In this way, I described the character without using statistical numbers and also put the characters in place so that the lessons that the character would have learned by second level, where we were starting, I could relay to the players in just a few words. That way they kind of understand the logic of working with the others in the group. I made sure that the other characters in play were a fighter and a thief for reasons that will become apparent in just a moment. Finally, you wear chainmail, carry a shield, and swing a heavy, thumping mace. Your backpack holds preserved trail rations, skins of water, the holy symbol of the light, a silver starburst, and 6 torches and a tinderbox to light them. You don't carry a lot of gear, but you have a sack of coins to do the work of the light with as you need, and to fill the needs of the company. I envisioned the cleric as being the most trustworthy. He would be carrying the purse for the company. So, since they weren't going to have an opportunity to spend any money here, it just was to kind of frame the adventure. Also, I had to make the other characters special in one way, shape, or form, so each of them had differing gear to kind of promote interdependencies. For instance, if somebody had played the halfling, their character had a great deal of food and supplies. Also, quite a nice little tank, honestly, with his higher dexterity and plate armor that he started with. He would be able to, well, he had an armor class down to 0. Now, before all of this, I made up the characters, but I had to pick a game to run, which actual game I was going to be running, and I chose, well, quite simply, I chose basic Dungeons & Dragons, the red box. The characters were only 2nd level, so they fit within the purview of that set, but all the characters were made using these books. Because this was probably going to be a one-shot. Now, of course, I had dreams. I had dreams the players would fall so enchanted with the characters that they would want to continue playing, especially since they found some nice gear. But since I only had one player in the end, and the other player is flaky, that's not going to happen, but I don't regret doing this. So, the game that I ran was The Ghost on Harrow Hill, which is a part of the First Quest series of adventures. It was a 2nd edition primer box, and it had all of the things that you needed to run the game, including some very nice supplements that really would help. This is First Quest. I'm sure you can get the PDF somewhere, and quite honestly, the soundtrack that I just showed you is commonly available on YouTube. So, you can run this game fairly easily. Now, The Ghost on Harrow Hill is a simple ghost story, but the CD effects are quite nice. It is very cool to be able to talk to somebody in a spectral voice that's not your own, and not everybody has a talent for voice work. So, I used the CD and played it at the regular intervals, following the cues from the adventure, so that my player was treated to being able to hear the sound effects and everything. It's a little slapsticky because the 3 central characters, a fighter, a thief, and a cleric, are all, well, fairly hammy characters in this. It's played seriously, but they're kind of comical in their own ways, even in the midst of this horror game. It did serve to set up the tenseness of the situation and what banter between characters might actually sound like, which is nice. So, I had the adventure. And by the way, this was meant for 2nd edition, but because it's a starter set, it almost perfectly overlaid with basic Dungeons and Dragons. There's very few changes that had to be made. The numbers all work out pretty much identically, so it's ready for back me right off the bat. There are 3 adventures. The first one is suitable for 1st level characters, although they'd best be careful because there is a potent monster in there. The second, The Ghost on Harrow Hill, takes the characters up to 2nd level, so they started at 2nd level. Thought it was appropriate. And I also somewhat defanged the adventure a little bit to allow them to feel heroic but not overwhelmed. It really, doesn't do to kill off your players just because you have the unfortunate situation of not having enough players. And I wasn't going to make anybody play multiple characters either. In the end, I ended up playing the cleric, and when the player playing the fighter left, I took over the fighter. But as you'll see from my method, that really wasn't that much of a burden. So how basically to set up the scenario, invited them to a party, did not tell them it was a role-playing game, and tried to get players to come in and take up a character with no character sheet, just this. Now, I did say that I had made up their characters, and I did. I actually had the actual characters right here at hand with the character sheets from Basic Dungeons and Dragons. So I had all their statistics and everything, the hard numbers right here, but I really didn't need them. The only thing I needed to know was two things. First of all, I took in a standard array for each character. So each character had 1/16, which is enough to give a +2 bonus in Dungeons and Dragons. Two statistics that were good enough to give a +1 bonus, and one statistic that was good enough to give them a penalty, let's just say. So they had an 8 in that. They had two average statistics, a 10 and a 12. And then they had a 13, a 14, and a 16. So I spread those around between all of the characters. So they all had a strength, they all had things they were good at, and they had a weakness. All of these would be very solid characters in Dungeons and Dragons. And no worries that somebody was going to have an 18 and a big whomping +3. Not a huge difference, but over time it does make a person stand out. Since they were second level, in many cases, I gave them maximum hit points, they were going to need it, and rolled an extra die if they had advanced a level. I gave every character a flat 2,000 experience. If you've played Dungeons & Dragons, you know that different classes have different experience requirements. So if anybody had played a magic user, for instance, they would have been but first level. If anybody had played the elf, they would have been but first level. But there were a number of characters that were second, and all of the players had characters that were second level. In fact, the thief was almost third level and certainly would have been there at the end of the adventure. The players chose the thief, and the one that had to leave midway through chose the fighter, so I chose the cleric. Again, I had all the other characters ready, though, so I'm still looking at manila packets with characters, miniature, and a 20-sided die in each one. So, how to run it. Basically, I played the CD. Little fog, make things a little creepy, and played the CD. The CD frames the adventure. The characters are in a torrential downpour, and ahead they see a mansion, shelter from the storm. If they had insisted that this is too hackneyed and we're not going in, I had threats prepared to drive them to it, predatory wolves who were stalking them, or the undead, and that works as well. There were undead on the premises too. It's a little on the side of no, it's totally railroading. What am I saying? But it's fine. You're there to tell a story, not the story of how they ran away from a story. So they ended up in the parlor. Now this particular game comes with a map, an adventure map, and it's a nicely illustrated graphical map. I find having that element helps for people who aren't used to role-playing games to kind of imagine the situation their characters are in. This is not a tactical map. This is a map showing the different rooms of this sprawling mansion. This is not a tactical map, however. This is just showing the various rooms of this sprawling mansion, providing some key elements that the players can look at and identify with, what objects are in the room they might manipulate, which can lead them to certain clues that can help them later on in the story. Now, the house on Harrow Hill, or the ghost on Harrow Hill, is fairly straightforward. There is a ghost. And some spoilers here, the ghost wants a body. doesn't care particularly who, it just wants a new body. And it's constantly threatening the players, trying to get them to sacrifice one of their number, offering the others freedom if they just cough up one member. So 1 life for the others. It may seem, well, it's not reasonable. No sane person would relish such a thing. But when the players don't bite at that opportunity, they are given a 3-hour time limit. Now, I enforce this as a hard 3-hour time limit, with checkpoints every hour so that, well, to let them know that the ghost is kind of getting tired of waiting. So the ghost makes an appearance and attacks the party, not in a serious way or anything that really drains them, but enough to knock them out or paralyze them, to let them know he's powerful enough to do what he threatens. So the players resist. Now, if the players had chosen to take him up on his offer, I had something in mind for that. Another game to play, because quite honestly, they wouldn't be interested in playing this. They could have killed the adventure if they had wanted to. However, it wouldn't have been a happy ending. Characters who take the ghost up on his offer not only lose the character who is offered up, but the other characters become damned in their own way. They can no longer attain magical healing, for instance. Their adventuring career is almost certain to be curtailed because every injury they get can only be healed through natural means, long and arduous, especially as they get more powerful. So, obviously this matters more for characters who are not in a one-shot, but if my players decided we're absolutely not going to do this, I had another game in reserve just in case. But I really wanted to do this one, of course. Now, because there weren't any statistics, I told them, whatever you decide, whatever you say, your character will do, or at least try to do. And anything that they try to do, that's what the 20-sided die is for. Roll that, and based on that result, we'll find out if you succeed or if you fail. And there may be times when I'll ask you to roll it, just with no apparent reason. I'd still ask you to do that. Sometimes I will roll for you, but more often than not, I'll have you roll for anything involving your character. So, the players were into that. They found out that they had to shelter in the mansion, so they went in without any great difficulty. Especially since the audio track kind of led them to that point, placed them in that starting room. At that point, I allowed them to start exploring, telling me what they wanted to see. They immediately started looking around, trying to light a fire to dry off. There were several clues in the room to start them off. They found the journal of the person who, in their life, would end up becoming the ghost, Gunther Weiss. Now, Gunther was a necromancer, not a nice fellow, so reading his journal certainly served to frame the adventure, which was nice, all delivered by audio track, too. I could have, of course, just dashed off a page and used my calligraphy skills to make it pretty, but in this case I thought the audio track would have been quite nice. So, that is what I used. Now, my players eventually tripped off the event which introduced them to the ghost, which is also delivered by audio track, and I do have a ghost miniature that I could have pulled out, but the ghost was never really intended to be something that they would take on in combat. Their characters didn't start with any magical weapons, and quite honestly, they probably would have started with one because I believe there was one as a prize for the previous adventure, but in this case, I kind of wanted them to deal with that kind of shortcoming and not feel they could fight the ghost off. That's a common problem with people just starting into the game. They figure that any fight is something that they can win. And they aren't intended to fight the ghost and win. It's powerful. And short of murdering the players one at a time, it just wouldn't be sporting. So they attacked the ghost, but it did nothing. In return, it knocked one of them unconscious for a short time, the thief, the fighter. But it then left, warning them that they have 3 hours to give up one of them or he would take all of them. And they could hear a clock ticking. So, the party began exploring. Now, to preserve the secrecy, I had these paper panels. This beautiful glossy kind of copper-colored paper. I have quite a few. I found them on a deal somewhere. I can't remember where, but I grabbed a packet of them. And I had them covering the map so that I could shift panels aside and show off the various rooms they would come across. This was hampered a little bit in hindsight by the fact that I had 2 lit candles and long sleeves, so I wasn't as mobile as I would have liked to have been. But we persevered. I had access to the table, and I didn't have a screen or any of the trappings of a dungeon master, just my various notes. My tablet was open with the miniatures hidden behind it. My laptop was open so that I could access the audio tracks. And that was it. I was running very, very minimalistically. So, the players were advancing through just like they were playing a role-playing game, which at this point they were. And the player who had experience with role-playing games knew this. He just didn't have a character sheet to look at anymore. So, it wasn't very long before they hit their first combat encounter, which was a room with some zombies in it. Zombies are great dungeon fodder for haunted areas, so having 4 of them didn't really matter how their bodies got there. There were 4 zombies in the room. So the players got ready to fight. All of them were... It was quite clear that they all had means of fighting. The fighter had a great 2-handed sword and was wearing plate armor to protect him. The cleric had chainmail, shield, and a mace, and the thief had his leather armor and a variety of weapons. I did write in the thief's description that he really didn't have the resilience to get in there in the first rush and do well, but he had a bow that he could use at a distance or throw daggers. So, he quickly discovered that he enjoyed shooting his bow, which worked just fine. It didn't help that his strength was low. He only had an 8 strength, so getting up close and personal might not have felt so satisfactory. But with the bow, he was fine. Now, because we were playing Dungeons & Dragons, the Beckme version, his damage from his bow was not improved because of his dexterity, but he was doing just fine. So, they went into the zombies, and I had, because they did not have any other dice, something special in mind. Now, I knew what the armor classes of all the creatures were that they were going up against, and none of them were impossible to hit. As a matter of fact, since they were all starting characters, characters don't advance in their ability to hit things until they hit after 3rd level in Dungeons & Dragons. They all had the same attack table, so that made things a little easier for me. But what I decided was this. Based on a post that I had read on Facebook, somebody had a really good idea, allowing your attack roll to determine the magnitude of a strike. So, when they rolled to attack, which, again, simple mechanic, roll a die to resolve anything that you want to do, they moved up and they would attack. And if it was too low to hit, for example, with the zombies, anything of a 10 or greater was going to hit, they would just do, as long as if they did not hit the target, they would miss. I would describe how they would miss, often by hitting an unnecessary chunk of the zombie that sloughed off, letting them feel like they still did something. It's hard to imagine a shambling zombie, if you have a sword, not being able to at least hit it. It's not trying to get out of the way, and it's not very good at defending itself, but you can hit it and not really hurt it. So that's how I described for the most part. Now, the players, however, when they did hit, I took note of what they rolled. They reported their roll to me, added any bonuses that I knew they had, and again, Dungeons & Dragons, the bonus was at most +1 or +2. The fighter had a +2 bonus, everyone else had a +1. The thief had a +2 bonus when he would shoot things. If they had the halfling there, he would have a +3 if he was using slings or... it was actually quite a good little tank. But they would hit. And then I would take into account how much they hit by. Now, if they were using a bow, for instance, that's a d6 damage. If they were hitting a zombie, I basically took the amount they hit it by and up to the maximum amount of damage, that's the amount of damage that I allowed them to do, adding on any modifier after that. So, for something so simple as a zombie, if the fighter rolled a 14, which is effectively a 16 because of his strength, and he only needed a 10 to hit. With his sword, he just did 6 points of damage, modified by his strength up to 8, which was enough to dispel these zombies. Simple and elegant, quite honestly. One die roll takes care of everything, attack and damage. Now, you might be saying to yourself, OmnusI, some of those weapons do more damage than that, and this is true. So what I did was I truncated it. I put the natural 20 at the maximum damage they could do for that weapon, and then rolled it downward from there. So technically, since that fighter could hit on a 10 or better, he had 2 chances at doing 1 point of damage plus his strength. And then 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, basically just drop off the tens digit, and that's the amount of damage that he would do. It would cover the full sweep of range with his greatsword. If he was shot with a bow, for instance, he had a very good chance of doing maximum damage and feeling awesome. I felt this was also appropriate because we had fewer players, so they had a better chance of doing maximum damage most of the time. Now, if they fought a tougher monster that would have a greater chance of failing to hit, then I would still keep that natural 20 at the top for maximum damage and roll down from there. So if they could only hit on a 16 or better, rolling a 6-sided die for damage, if they hit, that 16 would be 2 points of damage automatically, adding any other bonuses, and then the 20 would still be their maximum amount of damage. In Dungeons & Dragons, that works out fairly well. Obviously, if you try to do other games, you'd have to come up with a different mechanic, but so that it, again, obscured the mechanics of what they were playing, I didn't have them roll an attack and then a damage roll separately, and it kept the motion going briskly. Worked out quite well, actually. So, the players got into the combat, of course, as combat is always exciting, especially for new and relatively inexperienced players, and as I'm pretty good at description, exploring the visceral attacks and the damage that they wreaked onto the zombies. It went well. It really did. Nothing too complicated, and the player rolling with a thief had a penchant for rolling 20s, so he was doing grievous amounts of damage, which was great because he was the highlight player. He stayed through the whole thing. And they came through the battle with the zombies quite well. I also introduced the cleric's turning ability since I was playing the cleric, but it could have easily have turned into a slugfest either way. Now, because I was hiding most of the mechanics, I rolled for the zombies, of course. But because I wasn't rolling out in the open and everything, I was just kind of roll, 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 roll. I could determine how the narrative went. In this place, I decided I was going to play straight up. If they got hurt, they got hurt. I could have, for narrative purposes, fudged if I wanted to, but I really didn't have a need to. The characters had decent enough armor class, and I was rolling so badly. Most of my rolls were 10 and under. A couple of times I did score hits, the players did get roughed up a bit, and the thief was very close to death. But for the most part, I didn't have to go totally over the top as far as, hemming and hawing at what my monsters were supposed to be doing. Throughout the night, there were several combat encounters. There were some giant rats that they got to fight. There were a few ghouls that they ran away from. Ghouls are nasty. Unless you have an elf around, and quite honestly, a first-level elf is still awfully close to being prone on the ground, just not paralyzed, but dead. They banished a couple of shadows. Once they found a magical weapon in the level, they were able to go in and attack it, and I gave a little dramatic license that they were able to get a light spell cast on the fighter's greatsword, so he was able to go in and help attack, and because his weapon shed light, I dictated that it could dispel the darkness and could damage the shadows. Again, making the world live and breathe a little bit more rather than just saying, no, that doesn't work, and making the thief with a +1 dagger the only person able to hurt it. So that wouldn't have been cool. Now, unfortunately, the player who had the fighter left, and he thought that because we left in a fight, his character would just die. I don't do that. It's not fair to the players who are still there if they suddenly have a character die, because then they're short-handed, and I don't have any reason for the monster to die. I could say that he and the creature killed each other, but it wasn't very realistic. And quite honestly, that fighter provided a lot more security to the thief so that he felt like he could do things. I didn't think it was nice to take that away. Even though it's a horror game, there's only limits on how far you want to make the player start to despair their chances. So I played the fighter and I played the cleric. Again, it isn't very difficult. I'm just rolling a 20-sided die and interpreting the roll, so yes, it's quite simple. Now, you again might be asking yourself, but how did you manage things where, that usually a high roll isn't necessarily a good thing, because Dungeons & Dragons did that for some things. It was relatively easy to just flip everything on top, so that if they are, say, searching for secret doors, make a high roll the better roll. And if it's normally you roll a 6-sided die for determining if you would find a secret door, well, it's relatively easy to break that up. If it was a secret door they needed to find, then they would have a 17, 18, 19, or 20 would find it. And then the rest doesn't matter because it would all fail. You only have a 1 in 6 chance of detecting a secret door when you do. And the secret door they had to find, the thief rolled a 17. So it worked out just fine. Otherwise, that is the weakness. If you require a secret door to be located to advance the storyline, you can waste a lot of time in fruitless 6-sided die rolling, especially if you didn't have an elf back in the day, who would double your chances at the very least. The advantage in 3rd edition of being able to take a 20 was pretty evident back in those days. If you couldn't do it, it felt futile, unless you had a spell that would allow you to detect secret doors or some such, or had an item that allowed you to, even better. But no, the thief got lucky and found the secret door he needed to at first strike. There was a bit of role-playing, which was nice, because honestly, I don't get enough role-playing in most of my games these days, and they met an NPC cleric who was able to give them some spells and things and a place where they could shelter for a little time. And the player was inquisitive and asked questions and found out some information, crucial information that allowed him to continue intelligently throughout the storyline. In the end, he found his way to the crypt, where you have the final confrontation. And with the fighter and the cleric there, I was able to have the final battle. It was tense. The workings of the necromancer were undone, but it led to a fight against a creature that can only be hit by magical weapons, of which the thief had a +1 dagger. And he wasn't, let's just say, in a good position to be fighting. Now, the zombie was intelligent enough that, the creature, the Juju zombie, was intelligent enough that it knew when it was imperiled. It knew that dagger could hurt it, so it would go and attack the person with the dagger. The person playing the thief wisely handed the dagger off to the fighter, who had armor to fight this thing. Although, as powerful as that thing was, one hit still crippled the fighter and nearly killed him. Hit points being what they were, he could still fight. But the thief roved through the crypt, and he actually found the treasure stash, including a new magical weapon for himself and for the cleric. Remember, this adventure was made with these 3 characters in mind, so the weapons were suitable. A magical mace, a magical longsword, and the dagger that they had already found. So, with the magical weapons, they all jumped back into the fray, tag-teamed the zombie, and killed it, winning the day, successfully completing the adventure, and yeah, everything went very well. So, that was my mechanism for running an ambush role-playing game. You have to let the players feel like they can do something. The motive force in a role-playing game is choice. It's decision-making. It's feeling like you are a part of that world. If there's no immersion, if there's no role-playing going on, then you're playing Massive Darkness, which is a fine game, but it's tactical. It's a tactical exercise. Seeing if you're lucky enough to beat your enemies and putting in your characters positions that give them the best chance of winning, finding the loot that will allow them to win. That's essentially what Dungeons & Dragons is if you take out the role-playing after all, so in that way, it could have worked out if it was nothing more than that, moving your characters along. But when you get inklings of role-play going in there, when people are making decisions, not because they know they have their options of attack or move or use a spell, they start thinking outside of the box. When they start actually making decisions based on what their characters would do, then they're playing a role-playing game. And the mechanics don't really matter as long as they have a way that they are confident that what they're going to try to do can be judged if it's going to work or not. And it works best if the characters feel real to them, some way, shape, or form, like my little cheat sheet. Introduced them to the character, gave them an in media res quick information dump on how this person chooses to fight, what works best for them. And then, based on that, can think outside of the box and still try things on their own, whatever comes to mind. Or, by using sound tactics, get through circumstances and be rewarded for doing that. Yes, there's the element their characters could possibly have died. As I said, I didn't pull any punches, but I wasn't rolling particularly well, and I don't think the characters really were in any great danger until that final battle. Just could not roll very well. But I had the atmosphere, good for a horror game. I had all of the trappings of the game behind the curtain, so that the players only knew, I roll a die, if I roll high, it's good for me. So I could try things. I don't have to necessarily just move forward and attack. And if I do, I get to choose how I'm going to attack. Am I going to... As a matter of fact, fighter, first of all, in the first fight with the zombie, he thought he would take out an axe, throw it before charging in. That's a really good tactic. Except if you're inside of a room, so you could walk over and use your best attack anyhow. The zombie could just trot over and still attack. You're not getting any tactical advantage on it. But if you were in a larger space, like a very large room, throwing an axe first to weaken the enemy before you move forward, very sound. And I was actually pleased to see that. But by taking away the trappings of the role-playing game and just letting it feel like they were telling a ghost story, well, that was kind of special. And it was fun. The visuals were just right. I had miniatures for all the monsters. The characters had their own miniatures, their own dice, so everything was fine on their part. They actually had to do very little outside of be the characters. No distractions, just playing and enjoying it. And I think they did. The player who stuck through to the end said he enjoyed it quite a bit. I think the one who had to leave kind of regretted it. I think he was having a good time. So, do I regret that more players didn't show up? Of course. The interplay between players is often one of the most entertaining things about a role-playing game. And the introduction of new ideas outside of the box thinking and things of that nature are really what makes a role-playing game fascinating. Moving it apart from just a video game. But they did well, and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, all things considered. I would definitely not hesitate to do this again. Although it's a little bit more mental work, since the numbers are so small, it's really not that much of a difficult thing. Of course, it's easier on the Game Master when you give the players ownership of some of the mechanics and allow them to do things. And quite honestly, I don't think that allowing the magnitude of an attack roll to dictate damage is a bad thing. It's really no different from the mechanics that other systems use. For example, in World of Darkness, at least the original one, and I believe the later ones too, when you made an attack and you attacked really well, spillover damage was actually added on to your base damage. So when you hit harder when you hit well. And that's really what we did there. We just kind of took that extra mechanic of rolling damage away from Dungeons and Dragons and had it all resolved into one die roll. I've heard others do it, and I was enchanted with the idea, so I'm not saying that I invented this, not by any stretch of the imagination. We all stand upon the shoulders of giants in gaming. But it was an interesting technique and an interesting mechanism, and I think it worked particularly well. In hindsight, were there things I could have done differently? Certainly. My fog machine I only used a couple of times. Something about vaporized fog, the smell, is off-putting. Unfortunately, I didn't have other incense going, which I probably should have. It would have helped to enhance the effect. I have some nice dungeon scents. Dragon's Blood I always find is a good neutral scent, but there are other ones. I could have rigged the lighting to be different, but I was somewhat dispirited when I found out I was only getting a few players, so I didn't go all in, which I kind of regret. Spookier treats and snacks might have been themed a little bit better, but I was here in costume. I had all the visuals out. The players really, especially the player who was here for the whole thing, he really did kind of get into it. He's not a bad role player, and as a matter of fact, as I found out when he was in my pickup group at the hobby shop, which he and his son attended, and they're both quite good. They were thinking outside of the box and in character, and I really appreciated that. But he was thinking, again, as a thief, trapped in a haunted house. He looked for opportunities, but he didn't expose himself unnecessarily until he thought he had no other choice, moving up to help the fighter when he could try to finish off a foe a bit quicker. And ultimately, he succeeded as a result. It was a good night. So, certainly was a fine way to end a Halloween that I had been looking forward to for some time. Again, it's a shame that others weren't able to make it, but this is what was in store for them if they actually made it here and played a good couple of hours playing a role-playing game that they didn't need to actually learn rules or anything of the sort. They could have just come and enjoyed the characters and the camaraderie of playing with others and letting their characters succeed or fail based on their decisions. In this case, it was a win and a well-earned victory. If these characters were going to be played again, they would have come off with some very nice treasures, a good amount of wealth, and a magical item for each character. It really, would have been a good start for more adventures had they wanted to, which secretly is what I was hoping for. I would definitely like to run another game in Dungeons & Dragons, the old school version, and I'm grateful that I have that in my pocket in case that ever becomes a possibility. Of course, as 5th edition is very popular right now, it would seem to a person who grew up on 5th edition that this version is limiting. It is lacking in a great deal of detail. Being able to make a character in 2 or 3 minutes seems like the characters are disposable and trivial, perhaps. But for those of us who lived through the era, it was a good time. It was a very good time. So, thank you for joining me on this Halloween excursion. I'm sorry that I didn't have an actual video up for Halloween. Things got weird. But hopefully this was entertaining for you, and going forward, maybe it gave you some ideas on how you can do things like this. Again, by taking away the elements of the game that included rules and crunchy, how do I do this, and putting it all on the Game Master, playing a simple enough game that isn't overwhelming, it really did flow very nicely, and this is something that I could definitely use to introduce new players, even more so than taking one of those starting books and still giving a starting character out to someone, but introducing those elements easily and through gameplay. Quite honestly, not all that much different from the guided story that is in the Player's Handbook in the Red Box set. Again, giving you the story and then unfolding mechanics a little bit at a time. And this, simplest mechanic there is. Roll a die, high is good. So, thank you one and all. I am OmnusI, and this has been my Halloween After Action Report. I hope this finds you in good spirits, good health, and with a good game in front of you. Thank you, and farewell.